Alright, welcome everybody to another mixing video. Today we're going to be looking at a topic that I actually talk about in a lot of my videos, but I've never done a video specifically for this topic, and this was actually requested of me in one of my previous videos. So the topic that we're going to be looking at today is stereo imaging and creating some depth in a mix. So let's just listen to a little bit of this track here, and then we'll go and talk about some of the things that some of my techniques that I use to create some width and depth. So let's take a listen. Okay, so a short little example there. So let's go ahead and look at some of the things. Let's start with the piano. So all my piano and keyboard sounds are panned to the right because it's that real short offbeat reggae feel. So what I did to create some sense of width there was I went ahead and created a delay on the left side. I'm using H delay. You can see that it's only mixed in there about minus 9 dB. So let's go to a piano part and I'll solo the piano just so you can hear what what this delay is doing. So that's a real simple technique to get a little bit of width. You don't want it dialed in too loud, otherwise it will sort of muddy up the mix a little bit. But this is something you want to more feel than hear, and that gives it some real width. Now to add a little bit of depth, I added exactly that setting on the delay itself. I used some depth. Modulation really helps add some depth to your mixes. And to go a little bit further on how modulation can affect the depth, what I'll do is I'm gonna continue soloing the piano, but what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna decrease and increase this wow and flutter so you can hear what that's doing, because I added that on my pianos as well as my organs to give it more depth in the mix. So let's check that out. Excuse me. So wow and flutter is a great trick to use on pianos or anything that you want to have a little bit more depth on. So moving on the organ, what I did was on the high organ, I turned the attack off on a 1176 and drove the input gain all the way up and attenuated the output. So what this does is it just really saturates it, and saturation is another way to get some sense of depth in a mix. As well as I used a fast attack and a fast release to try and make these organs sit back, so that way things like the vocals can be more upfront. So let's check this out. I'll bypass the saturation, and you'll see what that does to the organ sound here. And that also has the piano delay. And to get a little bit more of that ping-pongy sound, the low organ sound I have panned to the left, and the high organ is to the right. So you heard a little bit of that, but let's listen to a little bit more of it. So the arrangement of this and the way that the organ player is playing that really actually kind of helps it have some movement between the left and right channels. And the person who recommended, or excuse me, requested this video, he was specifically asking about the electric guitar sound and the vocal sound. So I'll go over that. But the thing about the electric guitar is I don't have any effects on it. This electric guitar 4 here has effects, but that was printed in the track. So he's using like a wah-wah, some reverb, and a delay, an analog delay. So let's just listen to this printed sound, so you can hear how the producer or the guitar player himself decided to make some space for this lead guitar, and it's really cool. It's a really great sound. So let's check it out. So that's a really great tone. It sounds like maybe there's a little bit of phaser on there too. Before I get to the vocal, there's a few more things I want to go over. Um, on reggae tracks like this, sometimes I like to add a phaser to the hi-hat. And I'm gonna solo the hi-hat for you, and I'll bring the mix all the way up and then all the way down just so you can hear what this is really doing. And it gives it some space as well as makes it phaser to me kind of brings things forward and backward in the mix. So it really creates depth, but it also brings things forward, and it sits back and then comes forward, sits back, comes forward. So let's check that out. So that's a pretty cool trick, and it doesn't need to be a reggae track. You could do that in pretty much anything. And it's kind of just blended in there because a lot of the hi-hat sound is actually coming from the overheads. So it's not like that phaser is over the top when it's in with the rest of the drums. So that's a cool trick. You can try that on snare and stuff too. Um, Real quick, we'll go to the backing vocals. So I just have uh, plate reverb, and I used plate C because I used this plate in like 4 different places in this mix. So just to get a little variety of color. Um, I used this Aphex Vintage Exciter from Waves to kind of bring the backing vocals forward because I couldn't quite get it to sit right with the lead vocals. So this was a great way to bring it forward a little bit, but still sit behind the backing vocals. So this is a great tool for depth here. As far as depth goes, your biggest tools are number 1, volume, obviously. I would say 2 would be your attack and release settings on your compressor. So setting a fast attack generally makes things sit back in the mix, and using a slow attack brings things forward. So you can set things in the middle, so that way things are, not all the way back, but not all the way forward. So that's a great way to set the front back depth in your mix. And another one for me is saturation or exciter plugins. Anything that gives you some harmonic distortion, because those harmonics and having varying amounts of harmonics makes things come forward and back as well. So those are like your main ways of getting depth. And you could use reverb and modulation as well. So another way of creating separation from this lead vocal was I cut a little bit of the mids here. And finally, I added a little slap delay, about 168 milliseconds. It has a phaser on there to give it a little bit more depth. And yeah, that's about it. Some saturation. So moving on, let's check one last thing out. We'll check out the rim click here. So I've added a plate reverb here with the slowest decay time, or fastest rather. And as far as the width, I kept it at 0% because I wanted that snare reverb to be right in the center. So just listen to that real quick. Okay, so to me, without the reverb, it's a little bit lifeless. So I think that's a great trick there. So for snare reverbs, I like to keep it mono and absolutely in the center. So going on to the lead vocals, this is where the majority of the imaging and depth techniques come in. So let's just listen to this, and I'll bypass the entire send chain, and rather than going through each one, because I've talked about these in several videos, I'll just open up each plugin and we'll talk about it, but we won't bypass each one.
Run, 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 and run. Babylon I go come. He coming to take it away. No, 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 no. Far.
Okay, so you can hear that's really, really spacious with everything. So let's go to the vocal reverb. Once again, plate C, because on plate B I was using that for the drums. And as usual, I always filter out the bottom and top end of this. And this one I kept the width all the way at 100. And I also added a little bit of modulation to the tail of that delay just to give it more and more depth. So as you can see, modulation is also a great tool for that depth. I'm using the reverb for the width, and then using the modulation on that reverb for some depth. And to make things not get so washed out, I use a pre-delay, and it's a pretty long pre-delay. Not all the way up to 250 milliseconds, but say this is maybe about 100, somewhere in that ballpark. And that just helps the reverb not sound so washy, because sometimes it kind of can take over things. So I have a stereo slap delay here, panned all the way left and right. And what I do is I get a delay time, and I subtract 10 milliseconds from that on the other side. And then, as well, to get a little more separation from the slap delay, I use different frequencies on the filters, so that way the delays sound different. So that gives you a real sense of width and separation. So this is a great trick. Then I used my usual quarter note delay, and that one is just to have a little bit of delay throws when the vocal stops. This is my dynamic delay trick that I use with the compressor sidechain to this. And this is just a great way to have a kind of dark delay after the vocal has stopped, and that really gives it some depth also. Then I go to my vocal spread. I'm not going to show that because I've shown that in so many videos. Vocal octave. If you add an octave below your lead vocal, that gives it a real sense of body and depth as well. And then vocal whisper. This is just a whisper track of the lead vocal. So that gives it just some air, and as well as brings it forward a little bit. So the vocal in itself is very three-dimensional. And then the very last thing that I do is I go to my, which one did I use it on? The pre-master bus. And I use another reverb here. So everything goes through a reverb essentially. So even if you listen to this kick, we'll listen to it a little bit, you'll hear reverb on the sides. So this plate is a really, really great reverb, and if you have a chance to get it, I would check it out. So that's pretty much it for the imaging and depth. One thing that I always also do is I use this multi-band imager on the master bus, and I narrow out the very low end, because that really starts to muddy up the sides, and sometimes taking away something adds to something else. So this helps give you some stereo imaging here by keeping the low end in the center. Same with the low mids, I bring that more towards the center. Then the upper mids and high end, I spread that out to the sides. So you can see even just the noise from the analog emulated plugins here, it's imaging well, because this is helping out, as well as the way that things are panned in the track. So let's just listen to the track and just watch this meter here to see how things are imaging. And this track isn't completely done. I've been having a little bit of trouble with this one because in the actual DI bass track, there was some digital clipping. The preamp that they used must have been set too high. So there's some digital clipping there, so it's never going to sound quite as clean as I would like. But it's a work in progress, and I think it sounds pretty decent, and there's a good sense of stereo imaging and depth in this track. So what we'll do is we'll listen to the whole track and watch the meter, but I'll also bypass all the plugins in and out so you can hear kind of what's happening.
Babylon a go come. Run, run. Babylon a go come. Run, him run. Wicked man a go run. Run, him run. Babylon a go come. Babylon, Babylon, Babylon a go come. Ooh, Babylon. He coming to take it away. So you better run. Babylon a go come. Say the wicked man a come. Babylon a come. You better run. Say the wicked man a come. Babylon a come. Wicked man a run. Babylon a come.
So, as you could probably tell, when I was going and I was bypassing all of the plugins, you could hear that things just kind of turned flat and some of the life was gone. And you could even see it on the meter. I mean, when I bypassed the plugins, this image came more towards the center. And when the plugins were on, you could see that there was more left and right information. And the depth is just enormously different. And one last thing that I forgot to mention is if you have some sort of console emulation, I know Studio One has something similar to the VCC. The thing about console emulation and consoles in the real world is there's a thing called crosstalk that basically means your left and right information have a little bit of spillover from each other. And that also helps you have some sort of imaging and depth. You don't really get that in a DAW. So that's another thing that helps. So just to recap a little bit, I know this has been a long video, but just to make things clear for anybody who really wanted to know. As far as imaging, you can try things like reverb, delay. You can use EQ to get some separation. You can use modulation. For depth, you can use some saturation. You can try different attack and release settings. Always try volume first. And I don't believe I'm missing anything else. Modulation works for width and depth. So, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something new because there was a lot of different things in this video. So, I hope that you gained something from this. So, if you liked this, please give it a like. If you didn't, you can go ahead and give it a dislike. That's okay. You're entitled to your opinion, as I always say. And if you really liked it, please subscribe. I would greatly appreciate that. Thank you so very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.